Hi everyone, my name is Mark Yettica-Paulson. I'm on the Quandamooka coast and I am the practice lead at Deep Collaboration, at Collaboration for Impact, and just acknowledging that today I will be the person who will be hosting the conversation as we go forward. But I'd like to pass now to my colleague Virginia, who will be leading us through and beginning our webinar officially. Thanks, Virginia.
Okay, just want to make sure you can all hear me. Great. Welcome everybody. Just a moment. Okay, so good afternoon everyone. Welcome to CFI's Deep Collaboration NAIDOC Week webinar. It's wonderful to see so many people here today. My name is Virginia Goff and I'm Collaboration for Impact's Learning Manager. I'm joining today from Gunai Kanai Land, Southern Gippsland, Victoria. On behalf of CFI, I just noticed that. On behalf of CFI, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we live, work and travel. We acknowledge that sovereignty of those lands has never been ceded, and we pay our respects to elders both past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the contribution and sacrifice elders have made to better our communities and future. Many of you will know Collaboration for Impact based on the roles we play in change making. For those of you who are new to Collaboration for Impact, let me briefly explain who we are and why we are hosting this important event today. Collaboration for Impact is a not-for-profit organisation. We work across Australia to harness and work with networks and coalitions of leaders to create more equitable and inclusive systems, including in communities and on issues relating to education, early childhood and justice. We are seeking large-scale impact, so better outcomes for whole groups of people. We do that by walking beside people closest to the challenges over the long term to create the type of change that we could never do on our own. We take up roles as learning partner, coach, facilitators, trainers, often as advisors, brokers and critical friends. We're currently playing this role in over 40 communities and the wider ecosystem of services, funders, government and others across Australia. So why this webinar? One of our core focuses at CFI is contributing to address our unreconciled history in Australia. We see that reconciliation is an ongoing process between First Nations and other multicultural Australians that needs to have collaboration, equity and justice at its centre. Over the last 8 years, we've been working with communities, government and other funders to centre First Nations leadership in change and to build the conditions for deep and ongoing collaboration between First Nations and other Australians for a more equitable and inclusive country. Before I hand back to Mark, I'll just go through some technical housekeeping setup for everyone. If you need any support during the webinar, you can contact Paroma Kenya, who is our events coordinator, either via Zoom chat, our email address or by text. We will be recording this webinar and it will be shared publicly. We will not be sharing the chat though. We will be capturing the learnings. It's a rare opportunity to hear people's wisdom and learnings when we're in a space like this together. We've designed the webinar to be a two-way conversation, and throughout the webinar there'll be multiple points of wisdom gleaning using the chat function, of which the speakers will be responding to. We'll be using the chat. We'll be collating the chat after the webinar and sharing the themes back with you at the beginning of NAIDOC week. So we hope that this will be a really helpful resource for you to take back to your organisations. We'll be sharing a survey at the end for participants to provide feedback. So Zoom functionality, if you use Speaker View, it'll be the best way to view the webinar. The relevant speakers will be spotlighted throughout. We have live captioning, so each individual participant has the opportunity to turn this on or off as needed, and you can find the closed captions at the bottom of the screen. Do stay on mute for the duration of the session. Finally, in a moment, Mark is going to ask for introductions and we're going to require you to use the annotation tool. So when you have a moment, just have a look on your Zoom menu and find the annotate button. If you can't see it easily, look for the 3 dots and click on those to choose annotate. And we're going to ask you to choose a heart stamp in a moment in the introductions. So that's all from me today. Let me hand over to Mark Yettica-Paulson, CFI's Deep Collaboration Practice Lead.
Thanks, Virginia. Just had to remember how to put myself off mute. So yeah, got that and got it sorted. And someone's already done some annotations. Well done. So we may need to help people also figure out how to get that back off.
You can press undo to do that.
Terrific, thank you. Yep, so we're all learning. We'll figure it out in a minute. So I just wanted to speak to the purpose about why we're doing this. You know, Virginia had mentioned it before about how why we thought that coming to NAIDOC Week might be a good way for us to promote it as part of our broader CFI work. But the point about this is we wanted to highlight how the work at Collaboration for Impact, and in particular deep collaboration, as we work between First Nations and other multicultural Australians, we wanted to explore this theme around NAIDOC Week. It's a very activist-orientated theme this year. You know, get up, stand up, show up. And we intuitively saw that this actually represents some challenges, but also tremendous opportunities for the way we collaborate together. How do we show up and stand up together? How do we act in solidarity? How do we exercise our allyship? How do we collaborate together on outcomes or ways that we want to move together? These are the sorts of areas we're going to be delving into as we get to talk with the panelists. I'll get to introduce them in a few moments as well. So in the, as part of our working together, I'm just going to walk you through the agenda and then a bit around the how we might use the chat function. So we'll spend time framing up this conversation. So we'll hear from, like this is what we're doing now in terms of setting it up, and then I'm going to hear from the panelists, and they're going to be presenting a bit about how they're in their roles that they relate to this theme and how they promote the work around standing alongside First Nations or in First Nations leadership, how we can exercise our work. And then we're going to get some learnings from your responses to that first bit of input. So we'll be using the chat function to do that. A term that I've come to know this year is Waterfall chat. So it's a nice way to see all the responses of us coming through. And then we'll have a secondary panel conversation, and we'll go back to some of your responses, and if there's direct questions, we might be able to answer them. We may not be able to answer all of them if there are 20 or 30, 40 questions, but we'll be able to answer some. And so there'll be people working in the background as well who might be able to perhaps even theme up some of those and say a number of people are talking about this. And then we want to have a conversation towards the end around, so what are our actions? What are we going to do with this? How can we take some kind of action that we may have picked up in either from the presenters, from the panelists, or from the chat and from the way we've been responding back and forth with each other around some ways that we can actually take some next steps in the way that we prepare ourselves for NAIDOC Week coming up. Is there anything else then, Virginia, we need on that before we can go to the map?
No,
oh, yes.
The chat room agreements. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Sorry. We want to be able to make sure that it's a safe enough space. So when we're all in the room together, we spend time to make sure we have agreements on working together in this format here. We want to make sure that we use the chat room to welcome all voices and encourage that healthy debate, healthy contribution. We want to be respectful of other participants and the panelists, you know, and we don't want to show disrespect. So any disrespectful behavior will lead to you being removed from the webinar. We want to keep the comments on topic and succinct. There's post questions. Please make sure you post questions or comments and make sure that others or the panel comments to each other, but also to the panel for further learning and curiosity. So we want to try and promote it as a dialogue space, a place to better understand from each other. But we don't want to use the chat room to market or promote ourselves. If you've got technical support, the best thing to do is directly message Paroma, or you can even you can do that through Zoom, or you can text her. She's very kindly put a mobile phone number there as a contact. And yeah, we also, please refrain from putting any feedback about the quality of the session, not through the chat. There's an opportunity right at the end to say what you liked, what you didn't like, etc. So we're going to move now to the opportunity to annotate onto this map. Now, I'm new to this as well. So as part of our introductions, getting us to see who we are in the room, I want to give an opportunity for you, if you haven't already, to put the country that you are from in your in the name next to your name. So for me, I'm on the Quandamooka coast, the land of the Turrbal, Yagra, Quandamooka peoples, up here, what's now known as Brisbane, on the eastern side of that. And you might want to put that into your name as well. And we also want you to try and use this annotation function. Thank you to all those who are putting that in now, and just give you the opportunity to populate the country. And for those of you who are genuinely offshore, you might want to put something on the map that's in the direction of where you are. Just don't want to forget those people as well.
I'm going to have a look up and then have a annotate.
Annotate. There's a heart stamp.
Oops. God, now I'm.
Okay, so please don't worry if you've made a mistake. You can always click on the undo function and that will bring you back. And sorry folks, just bear with me. I seem to have lost my ability to run my own computer. So folks, the next thing for us is to hear a little bit more from who is in the room with us. And so I'm delighted to, I'll just wait for the screen to sort itself out as well. Carolyn, you've got a lot of love on your side. I'm delighted to be sharing the panel today and to be convening this panel of our guest presenters. So we have, we're going to hear from a moment by way of introduction from these amazing people who are leaders in their own right, in doing their own work. Nikki Moodie, who's from the Gamilaroi Nation, Associate Professor at the University of Melbourne, a friend and colleague of mine as we have done work around First Nations leadership. Carolyn Curtis, the CEO of the Australian Centre for Social Innovation, for TAXI. I've only just recently met Carolyn, but have come to hear about her from reputation. A great person who's been leading that organisation for a number of years. and of course from Anna Powell, who is the CEO of Collaboration for Impact. And we'll hear from her in terms of what Collaboration for Impact is also doing. So thank you. I might start with you, Nikki. So can you just give us by way of introduction, just a brief introduction about who you are, where you're from, particularly though, so what does NAIDOC mean for you?
Thanks, Mark, and hi everyone. Yama Malia, that means hello friends in the Gamilero language. I'm a Gamilero woman, my mother's side, and a sociologist by training, and the current Deputy Director and Program Director of the Atlantic Fellows for Social Equity based at Melbourne University. I think for me, this theme is so important because it allows us to talk about the ways in which Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, and Maori Pacific First Nations people, actually not just from Australia, but around the world, have been getting up, standing up and showing up for our own communities and our rights for a really long time. And I couldn't be more pleased that this focus on solidarity and action is a part of this week's theme.
Thanks, Nikki. Carolyn, I might ask you, so what can you tell us where you're from and the relationship you've got with CFI, and then what does NAIDOC mean to you personally?
My name's Carolyn Curtis, and I'm coming to you from Ghana land on the Adelaide Plains. I'm a Adelaide girl born and bred, so my education and upbringing and family have all grown up on Ghana land. We've had a beautiful long-term relationship with CFI and done all sorts of things together, but most importantly, I think we've learned a lot together. And I think one of my favorite things about the relationship that we've had with CFI is the vulnerability we've been able to bring to many of the conversations we've had. So it's never been about showing off all the bells and whistles and everything that's working right. Actually, mostly we've connected around the hard stuff and what's really challenging, what's not working well, what we're both learning, often the hard way. And I think it's been one of my favorite partnerships from a real vulnerability perspective. And I think we need more of that. We need more of being able to be real with each other. So I'm eternally grateful to CFI for being able to have that safe place with them. And I think for me, for NAIDOC, I think it's about taking accountability, and I was really thrilled to be invited today. So thank you, Mark and CFI. I think it's really about thinking about us as individuals, our own communities that we're part of, our organisations that we lead from within, and I guess finding ways to hold ourselves accountable. And accountable, again, not just on what's working, but actually sharing what's hard and sharing what's tough. And I think that's why I was really keen to join today, to be able to have an honest conversation and to be able to be real about it. So thank you for having me today. I'm thrilled to be here with you all.
Thanks, Carolyn. And so Anna, tell us a bit about yourself and why this is so important to you, NAIDOC.
Beautiful. I'm just struck by already we're in it, right? We're in the conversation that we need to have. So thanks. So I was born on the lands of the Bunurong people, spent most of my life on Gadigal land, and have a deep connection through my father's line to the lands in Western Queensland, big red dirt out there. At the moment, the last number of years, I've been raising my family on Mirrawena land in southern Tasmania. So I acknowledge all the traditional owners on the lands in which I've been able to grow, learn, and be in relationship with people over many years now. And I recognise that this land was never ceded. So what does it mean here and now for me? Wow. You know, there's a part, I think about many years of NAIDOC weeks, and, you know, I used to live in Glebe in Sydney, and the community would, it'd be a moment of celebration. There'd be amazing events held by all different parts of the communities. And I would find myself wanting to go to as many as I could, and absorbing the learning, the celebration, the relationships, forging new ones. But after a while, that just didn't quite seem to feel like it was enough. For me, I often finish those weeks thinking, well, so that sparked new questions for me. How do I, you know, use my power of proximity in you in different ways? So this year I am really struck by the theme, and I think to Nikki's point, the call for solidarity, and recognising that solidarity has been for many generations. There's been a number of movements, networks, coalitions, individual leaders too that have forged where we are now. So I think about that here and now for me as a woman living in southern Tasmania, as a mother of 2 young boys. I think about it as a woman with a Powell, a coloniser's name. And I think about that in terms of my role as CEO of Collaboration for Impact. What's needed from me in the different roles that I take up in life right now. And the thing that I'm really struck with right now is what it means to think about that in a collective sense. What are the kind of intentional relationships that I and those around me can forge, be in more deliberate relationship with those who we're not currently in relationship with? You know, where are the unlikely relationships that are really needed to really tackle the deep-seated systemic challenges, the ongoing work of decolonisation and reconciliation. So I'm thinking about that, yes, as myself, what's my own work and continuing journey in that, but importantly, how do I use the role and proximity I have for forging more coalitions, collective action towards that? And this conversation is another important starting point for that.
Thank you. And thank you all for the opportunity to have this conversation, have this dialogue together. So I hope we'll be able to deal with the fun stuff and the cool stuff and the light stuff, as well as some of the, oh, actually, that's a little bit close to the bone, or that's a bit jagged, or that's a bit rough, you know? So we'll try to delve into some of that as well. So, and I'm going to turn to you in a few moments, but I just want to frame this up with around our organizational response. How, from an organization that you're part of, how does that align with the theme of NAIDOC? And just before you respond to that, I've had the privilege of working with a whole range of people across the country over the last couple of years. And there was one conversation in particular quite recently where this fellow came up to me after we did this, you know, beautiful, wonderful workshop for a day and a half and blah, blah, blah. And he comes up and he goes, honestly, Mark, about 6 years ago, we wouldn't have given this a second thought. It just was not part of their strategic alignment. It wasn't where their organization's head was at. And so for them, this is almost like the first NAIDOC week that's like, oh, we should probably think about what we're going to do. You work in various organizations. I know that Anna, Carolyn, you as leaders in your respective organizations, highly committed to this. Nikki, in your leadership role, but you're also part of a much bigger system at the university. Could you comment on what this means for you in terms of how this aligns with your organization's role around supporting First Nations? And I might begin with you. Can you talk about it from a CFI point of view? And then Nikki, I'll go to you, and then Caroline, you can follow that up. So Anna, across to you. What's your organization doing about showing up?
Yeah, beautiful. So I might start with our origins, and then, you know, who we are now and what we're becoming. So our origins, you know, our fundamental belief as CFI is that there are systemic barriers to equity in Australia, of course. It's probably why all of us are here today, wondering what is our role and how do we shift that. And our assumption is that it's through it's collaboration and deep, true collaboration with people who aren't always likely to collaborate. That's going to make the real progress toward addressing these barriers and amplifying also what's working well. So that's where we've come from, you know, and that's core to our essence. And for us here and now, what that means in terms of the solidarity, standing up, there's three key things here and now for us. One is, and we'll continue this, working alongside communities who are leading their change processes. So that looks like coming alongside, learning from and with communities, Burke, Gladstone, shout out to the folks up in Northwest Tassie and Burnie, you know, who in their different ways are grappling with what does it mean to lead community change? Who's got the roles in that? Who's got the voices? How do we privilege First Nations leadership in that, particularly in contexts where they haven't always been privileged? In some cases, people would say there are no Aboriginal people who live there, and that's not the case. So the work looks varied depending on the context. So working alongside those communities, and not just the communities, you know, who are the decision makers, the influencers around the communities? And how do we really work across, you know, we can call it the ecosystems, so that we've got governments, service providers, funders actually aligning to the priorities of the communities, and importantly, the First Nations voices in those communities. So that's work that we'll continue to do, and to do as a learning partner and an amplifier for that. The second part is, and this goes a little bit to the structures and wider system challenges we've got, you know, I think, and we all have a part to play in this. There's no shying away from this part as a white woman. That's decolonising our structures and mindsets. That work begins, I think, with me as a person, with us as a team, and the work that we're doing, the relationships we have, you know, with government funders. It's the work of the micro that actually reflects that macro change. We want to see the ongoing process of decolonisation, and you know, that's strengthening and in supporting government in how they show up differently. Some of the structural work there's already underway and needs to continue, but how that work is done in relationship with communities too. So it's not that the big work happens in government and communities need to keep strengthening. It's how do we create environments where governments, communities, and everyone in between are actually wrestling through this work of decolonisation and reconciliation together. So that's part of how we show up and the roles that we take in creating those environments, supporting leaders and collectives in that. My last one, in terms of the here and now, is really, Mark, you're leading a lot of this work with CFI, is our support to like the regional, state, national voice treaty truth processes, particularly the work going on underway at the moment in Victoria with the treaty process, working with government, First Nations Peoples Assembly in how they stay in the relationship, stay in the work, the tough work together. We've talked here about the tough work and the tough conversations we want to have, you know, and sure, the elements of let's bring some lightness and fun to it too. But yeah, the work at whatever scale we're at is tough. So for us as CFI, you know, we feel we've got some skills, some ways of seeing that work to make it, to be able to name and work with the power dynamics, name and work with the systemic barriers so it doesn't become personalised and individual, so that we can stay in relationship and do the transformative work through that. And then where we're going becoming, look, we've just been actually as a team applying our own practice on ourselves, doing our own deep collaboration journey since National Reconciliation Week up until now, NAIDOC Week. And through that practice on ourselves, looking at how do these dynamics, roles show up in ourselves, in our team as a collective, we're able to then say, well, what does it really mean to authentically lead in solidarity moving forward? So we're holding this question. We know that we've got these commitments, but we feel like, well, what's next? What's the next? What does it mean to be even bolder? and even more, the word gets overused a bit, but really walking the talk and authentic in how we do that. So we're going through that process as a team too right now. I'll pause there. Keen to hear what others are thinking.
Thanks, Anna. And so, Nikki, you're in a different role to your counterparts on this panel, because while you've got that leadership role within the Atlantic Fellows program, you're part of this much bigger system. And so it's the whole idea about how do we be bold in a bigger system. Could you comment on that? But also from a First Nations point of view, how do you see this playing out in terms of the university showing up?
Oh, well, that's a very complicated set of answers, I think, Mark. I might begin just by providing some background about what the Atlantic Fellows for Social Equity is and how we're located in the university, and more broadly to hopefully make some of those institutional processes and challenges a little kind of clearer. So the Atlantic Fellows for Social Equity is, I guess, a department of the university. We're not a faculty or a traditionally constituted section of the university in a lot of ways. We were established a few years ago from the largest philanthropic donation that the Melbourne University has ever received, some $50 million US, to establish a 20-year program. And every year we welcome approximately 20 Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, Maori, Pacific, and a couple of non-Indigenous folks who have been working with us to the university to undertake our bespoke Masters of Social Change Leadership. And what we do in that program is that we invite people who have an idea. Now that might be a big idea or a small idea or a weird idea or an idea that kind of gets cooked up at, at work or around the kitchen table, but it's a social change project idea. And so people come to us regardless of their level of education in the past, regardless of the experiences that they've had with the schooling or university sector, which is notoriously racist and exclusionary of First Nations people. People come to us with this project idea, and we use every interaction, every assessment item in this master's project to develop a different aspect of people's social change project idea. We're evidence-based and anchored by Indigenous thought, Indigenous philosophy, and Indigenous aspirations. And so my expertise and the expertise of the team is in Indigenous education, Indigenous adult education, higher education, social change and impact, and also these really important ideas of ideation and proof, right? So AFSI doesn't have to pretend to be an expert in every single issue that fellows come to us with. We are experts in a range of other things, but we don't necessarily position ourselves as having the answer to the complex social challenges that people face. That's what fellows bring with them. So what I seek to do is to place this extraordinary set of resources and extraordinary set of skills and expertise that we have inside the university in service of fellows' solutions. And so that means that the work that each of our fellows are doing is in some way extending the aspirations that Indigenous communities hold. Now, part of the reason for locating this work inside of a university is because we're pretty good at teaching people, right? And so that idea that education, that literacy, that access to Indigenous thought and scholarship can happen both inside it and outside of the university is not a kind of a new idea, right? But we're anchored by this idea that education itself is the practice of freedom. And so what people have been excluded from in the past, the knowledges that they bring with them, is not something that we ask people to demonstrate in a performative manner, but it's an integral part of the solutions that people bring with them. So we provide access, support, we support leaders to do what they know is the solution in their own communities. And through that process, we end up supporting families and organisations and businesses with deeper learning about what Indigenous thought and philosophy and knowledges are. Now, doing that in the context of a sandstone university is often can be challenging, but it's challenging, I think, in unexpected ways. AFC has the benefit of being Signature Project 1 in the university's Reconciliation Action Plan, and we enjoy extraordinary support from very senior university leadership. And that has been one of the critical things that has allowed us to do the work that we need to do. Melbourne University doesn't routinely admit people who haven't started high school, but that is something that we're able to do because we have investment from very senior leadership in doing things differently. Where it tends to come unstuck is not at these high-level strategic leadership positions, but it's actually in the implementation of the day-to-day practices of support. So it's things like being able to pay someone really promptly for coming and doing a guest lecture for us without having them register as an external company provider through a third party, payment system that then requires 7 months of paperwork in order to pay someone, $500 a week, So these are the kinds of, this is where the rubber hits the road. I am extraordinarily lucky to be able to do work with very senior university leadership, people outside of the university sector to support the amazing solutions that people already have in their own communities. But it's often these tricky, right, like complicated internal processes that actually get in the way of us being able to do the work that we need to do quickly and efficiently to demonstrate that we are trustworthy partners, that we take people's time and knowledge as seriously. And we recognize that through often really simple things that aren't necessarily, that we don't necessarily think about. So like I said, I'm lucky to be in a position where I don't necessarily have to fight particular institutional battles. That has been done by Indigenous leaders who have come before me. And so part of my challenge is exactly as appears in the chat, right? What is business as usual? What do people take for granted? And how can we change those processes so that we can build trust for the people who we want to work with? And it's often a technical thing, right? It's not fun, it's not like hugely exciting, but it certainly gets in the way of being able to deliver outcomes quickly for people. I don't know, I didn't talk much about how I connect that to the theme, Mark. I kind of got distracted by internal institutional processes. I'm sorry, that's not very exciting.
No, that's fantastic, because it, for many of us on this webinar, I mean, that there's some of the challenges we have to deal with. It's like we can't always have, the minister with ribbons and film crew at everything. Sometimes we just need to shift to policy, and that takes a little bit of hard work and a little bit of strategic, get someone who's in the know-how to sharpen up that process. And I guess the two things that have already been mentioned around the decolonization and staying in relationship from Anna, but also yourself, they're talking about how we need to do the work to show we are trustworthy. I mean, and often that's not, the film crew. It's often the stuff that's day to day. I sometimes refer to it meat and potatoes. It's quite bland. It's quite necessary for us to keep the things going. So Carolyn, your organization, I was really inspired by the way you talked about, these are words we live by. And here we've got, some pretty strong words, get up, stand up, show up. Are these the kind of words that your organization can live by? Are these the things that aligns with the strategy of Taxi?
Yeah, I think sort of connecting in beautifully to Nikki and Anna's perspectives. So for anyone that doesn't know, the Australian Centre for Social Innovation, we don't deliver services per se. We really exist to bring people, communities and organisations together to collectively challenge some of society's biggest issues, but also build the futures that we want. And our organisation is really guided by a set of what we call words to live by. And this is our version, I think, of values, but they drill down deeper and really look at how those behaviours, those values translate into behaviours. And our first words to live by statement is around First Nations first. And we're really lucky at Taxi to be led by our wonderful auntie in residence, Auntie Vicky Charles, who over the past few years has taken us on an amazing journey. And so I think for us, our journey has very much been one that's happened from the inside out. And Auntie Vicky and the rest of us always felt very strongly that we could, hand on heart, operate in a really deep and authentic way before we started to have views, opinions, or tried to support others to do that. And often there's a real misalignment in folks or institutions or organizations living the outcomes they're trying to create. So I guess at Taxi, we've tried to build a structure and a way of being that means we're living the outcomes day by day that we're trying to create in the world. So for us, I guess that's kind of moved in three sort of different parts. The first one, which is a forever, there's no end, which, as I said, is really starting with the inside out. So from an individual through to our work and our big projects and initiatives, through to how we function as an organisation, has been a very big focus for us over the last few years. You know, we had a number of false starts. We went through a period of going, okay, so this is the dedicated focus here. But where we've arrived at now is this sort of beautiful space where First Nations first kind of weaves through everything that we do. So it's built into all of our rituals, our routines. It's built into how our board functions. It's built into how our work, how new work always starts. We have a cultural canvas that overlays all of our work. It's guiding our thinking around recruitment and how we recruit and onboard new staff. And so rather than there being these kind of, I'm just going to use the word chunks of, like, you know, you've got NAIDOC week, you know, you've got reconciliation week, you've got your reconciliation action plan. Sure, we have all those things, but they very much are supported by the weaving and connecting through everything we do. And that was a real aspiration for us. And look, I'm sure we still get it wrong sometimes. It's forever work, as you would all know. I think from us, you know, that was just such a profound journey, and still is, you know, all the little bits and pieces and intricacies of how you really embed First Nations wisdom, First Nations thinking, First Nations history into your work. It's such a journey. We didn't want that to go to waste. So Auntie Vicky led us through a process of creating something that really reflects our own journey in quite a deep way, called the 7 Threads Framework. And the 7 Threads Framework just has given us a way to communicate and share with others around some of what our own journey has been, and to help guide others on that journey. And so for us now, I think one of the really lovely things has been, again, back to my initial theme of vulnerability, to actually use our own ups and downs and challenges along the way to help others along on that journey. And I think one of the really lovely surprises has been how much of a role, you know, we're not an Indigenous-led organisation, but we hold Indigenous values very deeply and very seriously within the organisation. I think it's been a really pleasant surprise for us how much we can contribute and how much we can do to really drive a much more equitable agenda across Australia. And so part of us doing that at the moment is about us sharing our own journey and helping others along the way. And so we do quite a lot of that through the 7 Threads framework, but also just through all of our partnerships and initiatives. And then I think the third thing for us is around how we actually use the work we all get out of bed for as a way to progress these agendas around systemic racism, around foregrounding Indigenous wisdom, around true authentic co-production and co-design, around true authentic self-determination, and rather than trying to do those things I guess in a way that's disconnected from the change we're trying to create, we use the change and the work as a real vehicle to try and further those agendas and those I guess themes that we think are really fundamental in embedding First Nations first and Indigenous wisdom into everything that we do. So yeah, we've been on a really quite profound journey, and most recently, just to share one little story, one of the things every week we have a ritual or a routine where everyone across our network comes together, and we have a cultural stick. So someone from our network, which is what we call our organisation because it's a networked organisation, shares some deep cultural learning or an experience or something they would like to share or reflect on with the network. And most recently as well, that's been adopted by our board. So I guess at every level and layer through the organisation, there's such a strong commitment to learning. And I think when I was chatting to Mark earlier last week, I think one of the key things and roles that I need to play within the organisation is creating the space and making sure there is always a permission for the learning to be the work as well. The learning is the work. And it's not something that you have to do this side hustle around. The learning is fundamental, and we've really tried to embed and embrace that. But as I said, with many ups and downs and false starts along the way, and we probably need a good week webinar and a few things to get us through that conversation. But that's just a few thoughts to add to today's conversation.
Thank you. And thank you all for sharing. I'm going to try to, I guess, cut to the grit around this. And you've all mentioned ups and downs and challenges, perhaps mistakes, failures, things you have to do along the way. But all of that in the context of building trust, because you've been able to gain trust as you've moved through. Can you give us like quick snapshot, 2 minutes each around, so what is a way that you've been able to build trust to do this work? Nikki, Anna, would either one of you go first? And Carolyn, we can circle back to you.
Oh, which example to choose? So I'm really struck by, it's a bit of a theme I've got at the moment too, Nikki, the general is in the specific, like it shows up in that, the invoicing or the day-to-day, right? So look, there's an example for us where the choice of where to hold a particular event, quite a significant event, felt at one level fairly like a transactional decision. But we realised that it was way more than that. And it wasn't our decision to make. So when I think about trust building in that context, it was showing up saying, we got it wrong, but we're here in relationship. We're here with a genuine intention to address that. And I think about Carolyn's point about learning. I wholeheartedly agree. When we bang on about being a learning organisation, but it's learning through relationship, through the action. The learning happens through the process of engaging and being not mute in our relationships, but really genuine and showing up. So in this context, it was saying, what does it really look like to hold a discernment process where you as traditional owners can choose where this event is held? The ripples of that have been, I think what we found at the time is we had broken trust, and I was taught originally that trust can't be broken, but actually trust can be rebuilt. In some ways, I think when we stretch trust, like almost that elastic band that might almost snap, and I never would wish this upon, it feels terrible. But when that elastic band is so close to breaking, but we stay in that tension and we are genuine, in this case, we said, look, we want to get this right. What does that look like? Even our assumptions of how to get it right needed to be questioned. Staying in relationship, it's the yards of driving the 4-hour drive rather than having this conversation via Zoom. It's the having the coffees beforehand. We're genuinely wanting to understand, be in relationship. That's what made, in this case, us make a different decision and move into a 6-month discernment process about where actually we're best placed, not just to hold this event, but how are we best placed to be in a genuine relationship. And so I think about that elastic band and all the things that take around it. It is the day-to-day stuff that can't be ignored, of showing how much we are there for the relationship and in it, the drive up, the conversations around it, and trusting that sometimes it takes a long time. I'm thinking here it's long years. The relationships of, the transformative relationships I have in this space, they've been 20 years in the making. And a lot of times where we feel like we might have walked away from the work because, hey, what's my place in that? I don't know. Or this doesn't feel too comfortable. So the times when we've stuck through that is where we've seen the benefits, the work on the other side.
Thanks, Anna. Nikki, you've got a story?
Oh, mate, I've got so many stories. Yes, I do. Look, I think the first thing is maybe a principle, right? And that is that we really try hard not to be disingenuous, right? So, for example, when we're teaching about policy change, how do we get policies changed? Like, what is it? And it's a simple formula, right? Like, we know how policies get changed. But we're not disingenuous about that. So when people come into this program and they're like, oh, I want to do this change in this area, we're going to do this change. So we don't start from, I don't know, like the dumb policy development evaluation cycle, because we all know it's a lie, right? So we just don't start there. So we're straight up in recognizing that the decolonial objectives, that the social change objectives are real, that the racism is real, and that we're not going to waste our time having an argument with anybody about the basic premise of the nature of Indigenous rights. So I am not spending any time talking to people about, is racism real, or, how is racism experienced, or what is the nature, quality, and timbre of Indigenous rights. I don't need to waste anyone's time, particularly in my program, justifying any of those things. Whereas when I'm teaching into a non-Indigenous program, we need to spend a great deal of time establishing basic facts, right? What is the nature of racism? How does one combat racism with anti-racism? Why do we need to talk about culture and not politics, for example? Why are people, engaged in cultural learnings and not, for example, understanding the history of their organisation, field, or discipline? Why aren't people engaging in critical Indigenous scholarship and philosophy and rendering things as, cultural engagements? Why do we need to, spend our time, talking about particular things that actually just have been very resolved in Indigenous communities' minds and thought for a very long time? And so the primary audience that I need to build trust with is every Indigenous fellow who comes into my program who has had a racist, erasive, and diminishing experience with colonial institutions in the past, and every day demonstrate that the concerns and the knowledges that people have, their experiences are not just valid, but well documented, are well evidenced, and the antidote to those is also well documented and well evidenced, and we proceed on the basis of that information. So it's, you know, we don't need to have a conversation about what is self-determination and what are the rights that flow from that, because we know the evidence is clear that self-governance is the implementation of self-determination as the nature of a right. So the nature of the conversations that I can have with people to continue to build that trust is really, really different than if I'm having a conversation with non-Indigenous people.
Thanks. And Carolyn, have you got a bite-sized,
Yeah.
gritty conversation?
I'll keep it succinct and really, do you know, I was sitting here pondering if I had to name, I think my biggest learning since becoming a chief executive, it is just the absolute transformational value of investing in trust within your organization and partnerships. And whilst this might sound like a bit of a, I don't know, some weasel words, one of the keys to that is being able to really create psychological safety within your organization and within those partnerships. And we have now invested very, very heavily in that as an organization. And if some of you came and observed some of our rituals and routines, I'm quite certain some of you would go, oh, wow, you guys are seriously good at some time wasting. Yeah. So for example, we have in our every Tuesday routine, we have a section called our connection section. And it's about creating spaces for you to bring your whole self forward. Because at the end of the day, it's not a part of a person you build trust with, you build trust with a whole person. And so being able to expose your whole person and connect with whole people is really important and fundamental in building trust. So creating spaces as leaders, whether it's within your own organization or within your partnerships, to build that psychological safety. And that really happens through allowing whole people to connect, not parts of people. And I just cannot say that enough. That categorically transformed our organization, and it lives and breathes very strongly in every single ritual and routine, and has been very fundamental in Auntie Vicky being able to lead within taxi, for her to be able to, as much as possible, work within the green zone, not get into the red zone, but for us to be able to really voice and surface what doesn't work along the way. So that's just a snippet from me, because again, I could talk about that till the cows come home.
That's fantastic. Well, the cows aren't home quite yet. They're kind of, we can hear them just on the other paddock over the road there. We want to give us a chance for, okay, folks, you've heard a lot of stuff already. A lot of, and I'll use your word, your very technical word here, Carolyn, chunks. So you've heard a lot of chunks already around being genuine, being open, owning the mistakes, demonstrating the commitment to relationship, about the acknowledgement of the stuff that's real. The racism is real, the oppression is real, so the acknowledgement of that, and also owning where you're at in that, and working through that, but bringing your whole self in and investing in trust, really important. So this relationship now, we want to turn it over to you as participants on here and give you a chance to respond and to help digest some of what's going on here. So for a couple of minutes, we want to invite you to respond to the first question. So in the chat, just respond to what has challenged and or inspired you. And we'll give you a few moments just to do that, and just spend some time in the chat. And I'll pull it up so I can see that as well. So when you're ready, when you've got your thing formed, just put it in, press enter, and we'll start to see this cascade through like a waterfall of people's responses. Learning is the work, yeah, being bolder. Education as the action as act of freedom. That's a Paulo Freire quote. Am I right, Nikki?
And ably built on by the wonderful bell hooks in
Wonderful.
the Freirean tradition.
Yeah. And learning through relationship. Thanks. So there's a number of people mentioning there about the First Nations first as an important thing that stood out or inspired people. Yeah. Oh yeah, and the trust being in like stretched. I was with you on that imagery and I started to wince as you were talking about it, you know, stretching and the rubber band gets a little bit, you think this is going to break in a minute, but to stay there longer. Yeah. Yeah, and there's a comment there about it being intentional and deliberate in relationship, because that is the work. So the learning and the relationship is the work, as opposed to, hey, let's get this and get on with transactional work after that. Thank you. We might pull up the next question then to give us a bit of feedback. And I'll put the presenters just on notice as well to start to formulate. So what you're gleaning from these coming in as well. So folks, if you want to now put into the chat, so what questions are you still holding? What has been something that you may have been inspired and challenged by, but you've still got questions that you're holding? So what are some of those questions you are still holding? Thanks, Paroma. In a couple of calls for those 7 threads, Caroline. Yeah, thanks for that question there, Em, around the digging deeper into it. Where can I do this? Again, more interest in learning more, yeah. Thanks, Sarah, for the one, the recognition it takes time to build the trust, you know, at various levels. And thank you. How do we ensure that we do not extract more from First Nations? I might ask you that question directly there, Nikki, a bit about that overburden that we have as First Nations people. Can you tell us more? Can you work with us more? more information on the Atlantic Fellows. So there's a couple of technical things there that we can provide, but these questions around how do I learn more? How do I dig deeper into this? Where can I start to take the next steps? But I also like those questions around how do we do this work, knowing it takes time, but there's always this tension around the urgency. Things need to be done really quickly, but things take time. We've got to immediately deal with juvenile justice, but it's going to take a generation to shift it. Well, how do we work on these levels? So we're going to have a conversation back with our panelists now to try and tease out and work with their wisdom around some of these questions that have come up, things that have been inspiring, things that have been questions either directly asked of you or questions that you thought would be nice to respond to. So just what has come up from the chat, Carolyn, I might start with you. Is there anything from that chat conversation that you wanted to share, wanted to talk about?
Sure. You know, it's interesting. There's a theme in here that comes up that we had a conversation about just this morning with my own folks around time. And I think another very harsh lesson I've learned in this role, no matter how hard I've tried, is you can't cheat time. You try and find all sorts of ways, but you just can't cheat it. And I guess what I wanted to say is that, yeah, I mean, I'm slightly impatient at times. And one of the things I've had to really learn and embrace is that embedding First Nations first, the weaving the wisdom throughout the organisation and building that strong foundation of trust. That's been years for us. That hasn't been a 6-month project or like I said before, a side hustle. That has been a deep, consistent organisational priority for years. I guess over the last couple of years, we do cultural surveys just to kind of take a pulse of how we're tracking in terms of our organisational culture. And the last couple of years, it's come back saying 100% of our staff have deep trust in their peers and the leadership within and the governance of the organisation. But that took years. And trust me, I tried to cheat it every way. You can't. But I think the important thing is to start. Is to start and to hold it, to hold the journey and to say, look, we're not going to get here overnight, but this is the journey we're on. There are others that are on this journey that we can connect with. And if we can really stick with it through all the ups and downs, we will get there. And I guess the other thing I wanted to mention, because I really felt it, like my heart sank a little bit when someone said on here, well, what do you do in some workplaces? You can't bring your whole self to work. And that's where I go, oh my goodness, we need to have a very big conversation about the future of leadership in Australia. Because you know what, whether you work in social change or whether you work in the private sector or science or every organisation and institution and business should hold a deep social value around the outcomes for their workforce, and that coming to work is a good and safe and productive place to be. And that only happens if you invest in your organisational culture and people being able to live and breathe in the green zone. And I think until we have leadership that really deeply engages with that and dances with that and grapples with that, then we're not really having the right conversation about the future of leadership. So I would love to just go, well, you know, then you should do this and this and this. But I think you're raising a really important point there. And I think if the leadership within your organisation does care about the health and the well-being of their workforce, then finding a way for people to build trust with whole people, not a part of a person, is pretty critical to that. But I just want to stress, I'm also happy to chat anytime to anyone about any of this. And just to tick off one of the technical ones, if CFI are okay, I can just pop a quick link here that takes you to the some more information about the cultural canvas and the 7 threads. Not for promotional purposes, I promise, just so you can read about it. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks. Anna, you've got some responses to the chat.
Yeah, I think I just want to actually I'd love to unpack a little bit more of what Carolyn shared too. So I grapple with this bringing whole self to the workplace. 100% Carolyn, there with you around the importance of creating psychological safe spaces. We have rituals and processes of checking in and bringing as much of ourselves as we feel safe and brave enough to bring in for the purpose of the meeting and the interactions that we're having. So in there, and I'm quite deliberate around the caveats on that, because I think there's something, as we are thinking about the nature and the transformation of workplaces, not to get too down the track of, therefore we are all in this full vulnerability Brené Brown style, because I actually think there's much more wisdom we can also learn. And I hear that in how taxi actually also works too. There's a nuance to it, right? But I think we need to be careful. And I'm curious to the person who put that question about not some workplaces where you can't bring your full self in. I'm actually curious about the wisdom in that as well. So I think this is more of a, we could have a whole webinar on what that looks like.
Yeah.
But, you know, to distinguish between self and role and the system that we're in, I think are really helpful framings for some of these relationships, conversations, collective processes that we have. So that's one bucket. The other one is, and the 7 threads. Carolyn, I'm assuming for taxi, that came through a really deep process where you, as an organisation, collective people in the context that you're in, came up with that. So I imagine while they are 7 threads that others could learn from, the process itself was possibly more interesting and relevant as well. How you got that. So how do other collectives, organisations find their own version of that? I think is really interesting as well. And yeah, I've lost my train of thought the other one. So Mark, I might pass back to you.
That's fine. I think, Nikki, did you have a comment about some of the stuff that came up? Because the one question I did want to ask you specifically was around that one around how do we not overburden, you know, we're trying to put First Nations first, but then what happens if we gather all of them and put them all first, and you know, are they doing the work now? You know, how do we get that balance? How have you found that?
Oh man, there's a numbers game, right? You know what I mean? Like if every uncle, auntie, you know, little one got like what, 6 white people, we might, do you know what I mean? Like the numbers, it's just not enough of us, yeah, to do this work. I think for me that the answers to that are also in the chat. I think, you know, obviously I'm an educator, I'm an academic, I believe in learning. You know, I believe in lifelong learning. And, you know, I think that, you know, people are so hungry for cultural wisdom to navigate by. People have, I think, such a sense of the injustice that sits at the heart of the creation of this nation to try and find, you know, what is the solution? What is the strategy to heal that? You know, that injustice at the heart of it, I think, is something people more and more are searching for. And for me, the kind of the turn to lifelong learning, or the turn to inquiry-based processes, or the turn to learning communities where we can actually be in relation in our unknowing, is an incredibly powerful, it's a pedagogical practice. I think it's core to the way that Indigenous knowledge systems work. And it actually also asks us, I think, to step out of what I think can be a little tiny bit of an obsession sometimes with the kind of the cultural framing, you know, towards some of the other ways of understanding Indigenous knowledge. Is, you know, it's a bit old fashioned now to talk about rights and Indigenous rights, yeah, but we are nowhere on that agenda in this country. You know, there are other places, Aotearoa and Turtle Island, North America, that have different experiences from us, sure. But we don't necessarily talk about the wisdom of Indigenous scholarship and philosophy. People can barely engage with like Indigenous cultural products in the media, for example, or, you know, fiction books, right? And so really thinking about what does it mean to have a learning community that has that really critical reflection on how does your field, your discipline, your area of practice, your organization, what is its own history of knowledge making about Indigenous peoples? How is, you know, how do you come to know these things? I think is a really important part of that, you know, kind of lifelong learning journey. Then, you know, I think that opens up then another conversation about the relationship of the self to the collective. Because I hear both, you know, Carolyn, and there's these really difficult relationships between assuming that change at an individual level is the same thing as change at an organizational or systemic level. But I think regardless of where we are and regardless of our own personal capacity or commitment or availability or access to these ideas of lifelong learning, that there are so many other people who are passionate and connected about these issues, you know, and so we have these networks across organizations, across communities at different levels of hierarchies and different NGOs and businesses and all sorts of other things, and how we reach out to each other so that we're not the only person in our place that wants to connect and learn. How do we create those networks? I think is, I mean, obviously, you know, I'm an academic. Of course, I'm going to talk a lot about learning, but I think there's some other things that kind of come to mind for me.
Can I?
Okay, so you know, in a few minutes, we're going to go back to here for another chat opportunity for participants to respond. But just as they're leading into that, there's always this question: so what do we do? Wait, can you tell me what to do? You know. So from a very practical point of view, do you have advice around something that either you are doing or that can be done to do this work around get up, stand up, show up? That's almost like in a very practical nature, like because great understandings around the principles and around the language. So what can we actually do? What are some like real steps that we can take? Anna, you're off mute, so I'm going to throw to you first, and we'll see. Nikki, Carolyn?
So I'm going to do two things here, because I really, Nikki, I was so struck being in relationship through our unknowing as a process. So my mind went to what does that look like in the nuts and bolts of how social change is funded, how we show up. You know, I'm sure many folks around here, when we finish the webinar, we go back to the proposal, the grant, the report, the project level work, right? So what does that look like? How do we create conditions to see actually the work of change, transformation, being about relationships through unlearning? You know, that looks very different from a theory of change and an organizational strategy, right? So I think about that a bit. I mean, that's a little bit of how we see things in CFI, is how do we create the conditions, the environments for real transformative change that ultimately is about different types of relationships coming together for a clear purpose, which is about disrupting the status quo. So the second part, advice, I don't know, Mark, I have a reaction against giving advice around this, right? I don't think that there's a set of tools. I don't think there's a set of roles. I don't think there is a framework or a guide for this, and thank God there's not. I actually fully believe in the work systemically. So who are we as people? Who are we? What's my family history? What's my place? What's my purpose here and now? What's been called for? The roles that I take up in different parts of my life. So I feel like that's a set of questions. And then it's also, what does that look like collectively? And the two need to go hand in hand. We are social beings. I can only explore those questions through relationship with others. So how do I get the mirror back? Someone talked the other day about, that hall of mirrors. When you're in a relationship, you see yourself in different lights. My question at the moment is, am I getting enough diversity of those mirrors back to me, where I'm getting enough challenge? Am I using and owning the power that I have to then share it with where I can see the most change possible? How are we getting really specific and bolder about the kinds of changes, and how we collectively use that power to really to drive that change? So these feel more like questions to grapple with through, and I keep banging on about it, intentional relationships, but not the relationships that just make us feel comfortable. So that's where I'm at with it. If that might resonate with others.
Yeah. Carolyn?
I guess just a closing thought from me. Second everything that Anna was saying there, but I guess for me, to keep seeing ourselves as part of these systems as well. And that sometimes we see the change we need to create as something separate from us. We are part of that, and we need to take responsibility for that, and we need to get up, stand up, show up, and take responsibility for that. So I guess one of the things that I try to hold, and I guess I'd love to leave as just a thought today, is as part of the systems we're trying to change, how do we as individuals get up, stand up, and show up, and not see the change as something separate from us, because we're all part of it. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. And Nikki?
Yeah, I think that there is so much that we can all do to understand a little bit more about what are Indigenous rights. How is knowledge of the country that you're on being stewarded and elevated in the way that people live on this country? How do people understand the rules for how to conduct themselves here? So these are, on one hand, are like big philosophical questions about how does your organization actually work in service of Indigenous rights? How does it create the conditions for people to learn more about what Indigenous writers, philosophers, scholars, elders, knowledge holders, what are they saying? Like have your listening ears on. How do you create the space to be able to learn about the kinds of things that Indigenous people have been saying to you for a really long time? But I think, to kind of pull that circle back around to the idea of rights, is that our liberation is bound up together. We can't work in the furtherance of Indigenous people's rights or women's rights or children's, or any of these things that we care so passionately about social justice and equity and the ability to live the fullest, freest, safest, most creative, wonderful lives that we can. We can't do that alone. And so the pursuit of social justice, the pursuit of change happens together. And I know that both Carolyn and Anna, you might kind of read me a little bit for this, but one of the things that I kind of always talk about is how do we understand the conditions for change, because it's complicated. It's hard to know when to push for change, what change is going to be successful. How do we kind of get in it, and we can't kind of figure out what change is going to happen and when alone. So there are three ingredients that I often talk about, right? Like, you've got to have a plan. You have to know what it is that you are going to do. What is it that your organization is going to work on next? Then you have to have the relationships, right? You have to have the partnerships in order to be able to actually implement that plan. But the missing ingredient that we often talk about is timing. And that's not necessarily something that is always within our control. Yeah, so part of getting up, showing up, standing up is being ready, is getting yourself and your organizations and your knowledges ready to go when the opportunity presents itself. Winning what wins we can. It's politics is always an incremental game. Yeah, it's not one in the absolutes, it's one in the margins. And so we need to be ready to be able to push together when the opportunities are available to us to be able to make some of these changes that we can. Because I genuinely think, I know it sounds corny, but I think the power of the collective leads to these kinds of changes. So don't let me keep going, Mark, otherwise I'll just keep rabbiting on forever.
No, that's fine. This is an endless webinar. We can just keep going on for years and years. Folks, that's fantastic. Now we want to hear from you around, so what is it as a result of this kind of conversation that you will do to get up, stand up, show up? So thanks for putting that slide up there. So we'll put those in again into the chat, and we'd love to just hear your reactions, responses, as a result of what you've heard today, all of this great wisdom from our three panelists. How does this impacting the way you might get up, stand up and show up? Michelle, I think you may have had that one loaded, ready to go. Great quote from Lila Watson. Are you right, Rob? Yeah, getting the timing, being able to see those conditions, the conditions for change, investing in our teams more. Well, Nina, power to you for asking those tough questions. It's those conversations that we need to begin and help to free the space up. I was reminded of the words I think, Anna, you said about being brave enough and safe enough in those conversation spaces at work. So take care when you go in there. Check in on the decisions. Don't just let them happen and drift out in front of you. Yeah, and as often with this, it's not always about, I talk about table flipping, it's time to disrupt, it's time to throw everything else. Like, sometimes it's just, you need to make the cups of tea, you need to sit down and have the dialogue. Sometimes you do need the agitation, tough questions, pushing. Sometimes you just need different ways to show up and show your solidarity. And I think from a conversation like this, we either get, sometimes it gets confirmed or affirmed our natural way that we were doing change. But sometimes these types of conversations can spark up new ideas and things we hadn't thought of yet. Okay, keep revisiting. So speakers, as we did before, taking a look at the chat, the same as I am. Just want to give you an opportunity for your final words of wrap up. I know, Caroline, you just had a bit of a go before my last words, but these really will be your last words this time around. So to give you an opportunity to, to think about this whole journey that we've been on, from you personally saying, this is what it means to me, and then going through all of that idea, all those ideas about decolonization and working to demonstrate that you're trustworthy, the mistake making, the policy work, the practical work, all through that journey. And now coming back to say, so how do we do this? And so where are we now? Where are we now? So what would be your final comments, even looking at what people are saying that they might do differently?
Yeah, so many things. I guess I found my personal journey through this really, really challenging at times. And it's probably a bit late in the game to mention this now, but my first, when I was growing up and went through school, cultural learning just wasn't deeply embedded in education. Even when I was at university, it just wasn't a big part. And so my first introduction to really significant cultural learning, which ended up being really traumatic for me, was in my first job as a social worker, which happened to be child protection, would you believe? It was nothing short of traumatic for me. And so since then, I've had to undo, redo, and work with my peers and colleagues to be able to create a safe environment to learn. And I think I harp on about that today because I think it's so foundational. If we can't create the right spaces, if we can't create the psychological safety and the trust, then the right learning can't happen. And I think that has categorically been my experience. But it's also really shaped me and changed me as a type of leader that I am. And I've had to really let go of things. I've had to change my own behavior. I've had to do deep reflecting in terms of myself. And there's parts of that have actually been really painful and really tough. And I'm sure there'll be more. And that's what I mean when I keep saying, we are part of these systems. And the change we're trying to create is not separate from us. So I think for me, something you do have control over, because so often there's so much we don't have control over, but something you do have control over, I guess, is you and who you are and how you think and the values you hold and how they play out within your family. And sometimes through focusing on that and finding some great alignment and steadiness in that, it can then give you more energy and more confidence to springboard into playing a more influential role in your jobs, in your communities, in your partnerships. And I didn't have that. And I kind of did it in reverse. And that was so much harder. So I think through some of those very foundational pieces around self, you can build a really solid platform for yourself to then springboard into the next space. And that is something you do have control over. So I guess that's just one little thought I'd love to leave with you today.
Thank you. Thanks, Caroline. Anna, Nikki, any closing comments you want to add?
You want to jump in, Nikki?
Do you want to go?
Well, I go, then you can have the parting word. My notepad is full. I'm lots to reflect on, and particularly the chat room. Wouldn't it be great one day to have this conversation, a dialogue in person, big group of us. more of that, please. Look, I'm struck with this idea of kind of like the fluidity of roles that are needed. When we think about get up, stand up, show up, it doesn't look like one volume everywhere we go, right? And doesn't look like one act everywhere we go. It's like, to Nikki's point, reading the timing, reading the context, reading the roles, you know. So when to be quiet, when to be loud, what to be loud about, who to be in relationship with. So that's just, I am holding that as it's a constant process of being present, being mindful and aware of our own power and rank, and not shying away from that, but knowing when it can be helpful and when it's hindering the progress. So I'm thinking a lot to the deep collaboration practice in that, that I've found really forming. And then I think about how we're doing that, you know, yes, self individually, as a collective, organisationally. Also, how are we doing that? You know, I'm getting on. There's a new, that we are growing as CFI, you know, brings in new people. There's new generations of leaders in this space who are coming. So I think about how are we supporting creating spaces for the next generation, but where are the coalitions and networks of the leaders coming up, who are also becoming skilled to discern, to work out when to be loud, when to be quiet, how to work with fluidity of roles, and what's our responsibility to be able to create those environments as well for them. Yes, get out of the way. Yes. Nikki.
I think that's so important. You know, where are those partnerships? What are those collaborations? Where are those voices coming from? And what's the plan that they have when they get there? You know, like, you know, Indigenous knowledges are, you know, often I think primarily concerned with how to conduct oneself properly in the world, how to conduct oneself properly in relation to country, how to conduct oneself properly in relation to others, and to be able to think about how that ethic of relationality is something that defines being on this continent. I just think is such an essential and, you know, to my mind, really interesting question about the nature of the future that we're kind of working towards. But to be able to get to the point where we're talking not just about the knowledges that we need, the partnerships that we need to act upon, the partnerships that we need to activate, but the plan for action that we have when we get there, you know, when the timing presents itself, when the opportunities arise, what are we actually going to do together to be able to create this future that can be decolonial, that can give rise to other ways of living in relation with each other and in relation with the country that we're on. And I hear that point, Carolyn, about the role of self-care. You can't be fighting for justice or social equity if you're hangry. Yeah, if you need a little nap, if you, you know, like, we have to be able to be well in this fight and to be well in the pursuit of social justice and social equity, I think is a decolonial act in and of itself. You know, so I think that there are so many facets of life in which this work takes place, and really important to kind of honor and recognize all of them. But yeah, it's such a privilege to be part of this conversation, and my notepad is full and my mind is buzzing. I'll just kind of keep talking unless you stop me, Mark. So I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, all three of you, for bringing your whole selves in, sharing a bit about how, yeah, this was great. Actually, this was really challenging. I made a mistake. Here's where we had to learn from picking things up. The grit part of this, the resilience part of showing a dedication to trust building is such an important platform, such an important condition for getting up, standing up, and showing up. Otherwise, we end up turning up and people are looking at us and, well, where have you come from? well, I haven't seen you in the last, 200 years where we're trying with the struggles and stuff. And it's like, so how do we do this? How do we take this together? And you've each given us insights into different ways from through different lenses as well. So thank you for that. So folks, as we begin to conclude our work here, we want to give you an opportunity to give a sound bite around so where we are at now and so what this looks like for us as we are preparing to leave this space. So we've got a Mentimeter, is that the right way to say it? Mentimeter, and it should be, fingers crossed, you click and then you should be able to just put one word in and then it will form a word cloud that we'll be able to visualize and see. Thank you, Paroma, for that. So you should be able to click on there and then write one word. We're just asking for one word that describes how you're feeling now as a way of saying, wow, this last hour and 3/4, thanks, this is what I've picked up. This is where I'm at now. And I understand that we're going to show the visualization of this and it will grow as we get to see that. Thank you. Thank you. The I've always liked the way that we watch the words change. If you're wired up like me, you're like, so is anything going to overtake inspired? Is anything going to get bigger than inspired? But I'm very happy that that's the biggest word there. Thank you very much. So that will keep going and we'll be able to send that around to people as well as with the other materials that we'll send back to everyone who's signed up.
Energized.
And I wanted to now give us a chance to just take a look at, this webinar that we're doing here is part of a much bigger, broader set of learning programs that we do at Collaboration for Impact. Some of them specifically on how First Nations and others collaborate, which is deep collaboration. That's the work that I'm involved in, the work that I'm leading, but it's also part of our broader systems public learning program that we have, of which Virginia is taking a lead on that. So we'll be able to make sure that we send through details of what they are, and you can always visit our website to see that. Thank you. There's a Collaboration for Impact learning programs, and you can sign up for some of those. And for the deep collaboration one, do we have a slide that shows? Thank you. So there's an opportunity, some concrete opportunities. I know people were asking before about where can I deepen this? So there's just two options. I will give a shout out to Atlantic Fellows, also to the work that Taxi does. You have great opportunity for anything that they're involved in. Try and jump in, get involved and be part of that. And of course, as Anna would probably echo, you're always welcome to be part of what we're doing here at Collaboration for Impact. So folks, that's the end of our time, the end of the program. We have reached the point where it's like, look, we didn't know what this was going to be 1.5 hour, 2 hours. So we kind of got somewhere in the middle of that. I want to give people an opportunity to give us the last couple of minutes of their time to do a post-event survey. But whether you are already diving into that or whether you're you've got to leave because you've got to be somewhere in the next little while, Zoom to Zoom, can you please join with me in the chat by thanking and showing your appreciation to our panelists. I'd also like to give a shout out and acknowledgement to all the people who work behind the scenes, Virginia, Paroma, and Tammy and others who have been working behind the scenes to make all of this possible. So many thanks. Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Anna, for your wisdom and sharing with us today. I wonder if that is that post-survey event been shared in the chat as well? I think
The
so.
survey has been shared, so thank you everyone for taking the time to do that. We really appreciate that. And thank you so much to you, Mark, for holding today's conversation. It was very inspiring, challenging. I'm inspired. Thank you to Caroline, to Nikki and to Anna. Such wonderful contributions. I appreciate it so much. On behalf of CFI and everyone here, thank you very much.
Thank you.